Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Hearts of Iron 4 Dev Diary. Do you hate the oppressive forces of capitalism? Do you think the industrializing factions inside your country have left the agrarian workforce behind? Do you like having a cool hairstyle? Introducing communism. That's right, today we're going to be covering Communist China, or more specifically, the Chinese Soviet Republic. In this, we're doing both historical and ahistorical. We begin with a great view of the Great Wall of China stretching over the many hills. Again, I'm surprised such a model has made its way into this game. They've even differentiated between the steps versus the walkways. Like you can tell this is a staircase versus a walkway. So interesting. The Chinese Soviet Republic now begins not with Mao Zedong but Zhang Wentian. With it comes new national spirits and focuses to work towards, so it seems like Mao may be a little bit away. Upon starting the game, some aspects of the screen may be familiar, specifically the manpower law being set to ridiculously high, assuming you can take your core territory back. Something new, however, might be the balance of power that we'll get onto later. Your starting spirits fall into the traditional trend of beginning with negative. Your defunct state bank is not a good bank at all and only causes you problems. The Central Committee has stopped you from justifying war goals. The Chinese Red Army has destroyed, well, your army, and agrarian society really stops you from building things, but massively stops you from researching things. In short, it's the traditional you start off in a terrible situation, but I suppose even more terrible after some of these map changes. For those who want to recap, this is what the current, or respectively old, version of the map looked like, with Communist China existing right here. Now, the Chinese Soviet Republic has, in a sense, gotten smaller, but also consists of two states instead of one, meaning there are far more states across the board, not to mention all the new countries that are here as well. I'm taken aback by Shandong clique and Guangdong clique not being the same colour as China anymore, meaning maybe they're not going to be puppets of China at the start of the game. Personally, I'm super interested to see what the Northeastern Army is all about, but I suppose that's not for this dev diary. Strange crowns in the sea. The dev diary continues by explaining those states that I just mentioned have been split up, one of them here being Yulin, and not only are they far smaller, but they also come with negative debuffs, resource gain efficiency, local manpower, local supplies. So not only are you missing core territory, but what little core territory you do have has very little manpower. For those who might have missed it, the Chinese Soviet Republic is in an ongoing war with China, but the ever-looming threat of the Japanese has kind of put a stalling moment inside of this conflict, and as such it's up to you to decide the next course of action, with the Chinese Soviet Republic focus tree. Goodness, I love low quality images. Alright, let's not spend too long here, but just to give you the core gist, in the middle, just below the mandatory first focus, is the industry tree. Then on the right, we've got the military tree with 3 sub-branches for army, air and navy. On the left then is our politics, which is the last thing we'll cover. On the far left, you've got the historical Maoist branch. On the middle, you've got the alternative Bolshevik branch. And on the far right, you've got an interesting duality branch, of which all of them culminate in the bottom branch about the People's Republic of China. I'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but on initial reaction, I am somewhat surprised about how short some of these branches feel, especially for a country that will one day become one of the leading superpowers of the world. But overall, nothing too negative, and at least it's very clearly laid out. Let's begin then with the industry tree. My goodness, the quality could be better. Rallying the industry and heading straight down to re-establish the state bank. That bank was pretty negative, as well as an immediate choice on how you're going to specialise your industry. As you move down towards the bottom, we can expect things most likely like getting up your research slots. I see form the Academy of Sciences down here at the bottom, with some interesting additions, including the construction of dams, which was the thing they added in Gotterdammerung. The dev diary discusses that when making this industry tree, they wanted something different than the Soviet Union or Germany, introducing a risk-reward system for the player to choose how risky they want to play it. With that choice halfway down the industry tree, you'll have to choose between the first 5-year plan or shorter market plans. With it, a timer will begin on how quickly you can set up an industry, and that comes with a target you have to meet by the 900 days or 1825 days respectively, 62 civs and either 54 mils or 72 mils. Considering how many factories you're going to need here, this definitely seems like a conquest based expansion, less so than a building up kind of industry. One can therefore assume that if you're probably playing the safer plan, you want to initialize a 5-year plan to give you more breathing space to try and meet the targets, but you can do the shorter market plan, which might be a little tighter, considering that mills are pretty fast to build comparatively, so I feel like the timer on the shorter end is going to be the stressful one. The dev diary says that due to the impending threat from Japan, you might join the other warlords in nationalist China, and so your ability to expand and therefore expand your industry is limited, so they added the focus rural surveys. You now have the option to add building slots to states, however it can only be used 5 times. I'm going to assume this means 5 times total and not 5 times per state, considering it's in the decision tab and not on the map. Moving on down, they start to cover rural or urban development. I guess it would be covering a communist focus tree if we weren't talking about the differences between urbanization and supporting rural development. If we're covering exclusively what the focuses do, I could imagine that if you're struggling to continue your expansion, then ensuring you have more supplies and manpower might be an appealing idea. But overall, I'm always a fan of just expanding the industry internally, and so I always like setting the state category higher, getting more civs, construction speed, factory output, so I'm typically going to be leaning on the right side. Once finished, you will end up with either your agrarian society turning into agrarian reform, meaning you've kept some elements, but the research speed is maybe still in the toilet, or urban society, where at least you've pepped your research speed back up to where it could be. Ultimately, the urban society does seem to come across with the better buff, but again, the manpower and supply might be useful to you. Ultimately, the industry tree was pretty much what one could expect. It doesn't do anything too remarkable, and it kind of is a distant from the old version where all of the Chinese characters had a shared branch which had some of their industry. Now they've got a very traditional kind of industry tree. However, moving on to talk about the military, the dev diary begins by showing many of the generals available. Mao Zedong leading at the top, Lin Biao, I think this is a woman here with Li Jian, Zhang Yuni, and where is he? Any Gaogang enjoyers? One feature they're introducing, which I really like, I think it's a good piece of kind of narrative storytelling intertwined with a gameplay mechanic, is giving certain generals Survivor of the Long March, meaning simply by looking at the ability of the character, you know some of their historical background that they're a survivor of the Long March. I think that's such a good idea. It would be cool to see this applied with other generals in the game, to be like, oh, this person served in this place, so they have a bonus to something there. It's like kind of small storytelling just within the context of the general's traits. I don't know, I think it's a good idea. Does anybody know what those opium addict traits did anyway? Anybody? Just me? Never mind. To continue complementing some of the stuff they're introducing with the military tree, I also like something they're introducing where, because this is an ongoing situation with Communist China, their forces returning from the Long March haven't actually all unified in one location yet, and so all your forces have yet to arrive in Shanbei. This includes veteran generals like He Long and Zhang Gutao. Getting to see a better image of the military focus tree, at least the first section, kind of prior to the proper build-up of the third phase, we can see the consolidation of the Red Army to being reborn, and with it, a nice chunky middle section with some key decisions to make. I continue to enjoy how you're tracking the progression of the reintegration of the disparaged, distant army into one central unit with the context of the Japanese invasion looming. Perhaps on the more negative side, however, It does however mean you're probably going to be spending some time fixing the Chinese Red Army, which does come with some debuffs to division attack, recruitable population, and perhaps most painfully, org. Goodness me, we need our organisation. A weird line in the dev diary says that after that, the player will have the chance to form the People's Liberation Army and all of its different branches. Actually, it's most. You're not getting a Space Force this DLC. I'm terribly sorry to disappoint. What do you mean, this DLC? Do you mean that it could be a DLC and not this DLC? It would be so fascinating to find out that one day they could hypothetically make a kind of late stage finale DLC, which is actually about finding a conclusion to the game, making it so there's ways to win through world conquest and you actually get a very clear victory condition for conquering the world, or alternatively there's one where you need to build a rocket and control the skies. After Gotterdammerung, they did rework how some of the nukes and missiles looked in the game, so introducing rockets at this point wouldn't actually be that far-fetched from the current product. But ignore me, we choose to go to a moon in a different time period. For now, let's get back to MAO. After renaming the Red Army to the People's Liberation Army Ground Force, you have begun to prepare the third phase and its 3 separate branches, covering the Army, the Air, and the Navy. In total, we don't see anything too dramatic across the board. They're not particularly huge, kind of mirroring slightly bigger than what you'd expect from a generic focus tree. So again, not too dramatic, but I imagine with the threat of the Japanese, by the time that you're doing these focuses, you're kind of on the offensive against the Japanese, or maybe you've kicked them out entirely. So let's just fly through some of these. Inside of the ground force, you can expect focuses to fix up the Red Army with all of its negative traits and turning them into positive ones. As, you know, we could expect, including giving experience to some of your generals. There is an achievement out there that requires you to have, I think, a max level general as potentially a warlord, but maybe it's just anybody. So maybe we'll see more repeating focuses about giving experience to generals. Along the way, you might even find an option to appeal for foreign aid and ask for T-34 tanks from the Soviet Union. How much use you're really going to get out of 250 tanks inside of China, I can't comment on. I think I'll be sticking to my mountaineers, but you're welcome to take advantage of them. The Navy comes up next, which is interesting considering that your country starts landlocked at the start of the game. But don't worry, as there are focuses in here to immediately build up factories or dockyards to build some ships. In the case of invest in dockyard construction, you have 4 dockyards for 70 days, which is better than 3 for 70 days in the generic focus tree. Wow, the power creep goes crazy. I think it's because China starts as a landlocked nation with no ships that you'll find that a lot of the focuses are basically about giving you production lines for different types of ships. So as we can see on the right from these 4 focuses, you get nearly completed ships already that you can get out relatively quickly. Still, I doubt it's going to be enough to take down the Japanese Navy and invade Kyoto. And lastly, let's talk about the Air Force. Where's the Air Force? Much like what we saw with the Navy, the planes inside of this country are somewhat lacking in existence, and as such, they've had to take their own route of trying to introduce the ability to research planes and start building them up, because ultimately this is a video game and you may need to stray into the realms of building up green air to try and tackle some enemies. Should you finally find the time to complete all 3 branches, you get a modern army, a modern air force, and a modern navy, with buffs to your spirits all across the board, leading to the final focus, the Central Military Commission, which gives you passive experience gain on all of the different factors of the army, and flat experience across the board. If I'm going to be blunt or honest, I do think that final spirit is a little disappointing. By the time you've made it down this tree, not to mention your industry and politics, which is probably more important, you might have finished all your doctrines, a lot of your division designs would have been done. In fact, what at this point are you really wanting all that experience for? The real goal and hope, I suppose, of getting to the bottom of one of these trees is things that's going to really help you in the late game. If I was going to think about it, I was considering using your combat width reduction to be able to stick more of the men you've gathered and acquired from getting back your core territory into the army. Maybe even a bonus against fighting other major nations, considering that this focus will most likely be played off the back of fighting both a faction leader with China and also the Japanese, an actual major. So yeah, they could have done a little bit more with that final focus, and it's kind of disappointing. And finally, let's talk about those three political branches. We mentioned earlier that Communist China will now start with a balance of power, and that balance of power will be depicting how Mao had not solidified his leadership over the Central Committee by 1936. As a result, you'll end up with something that looks a lot like the Italy balance of power, vying between Mussolini and the Council of Foch. Instead of the council though, Mao will be facing up against the 28.5 Bolsheviks, and depending on which way you go down your balance of power, you will determine which way you're going to go down your focus tree. The shorthand of it though is Mao is going to give you bonuses towards your military with encirclement penalty reduction and command power gain, while going with the 28.5 Bolsheviks gives you factory output, dockyard output, and the ever tasty civ factory construction speed. So, starting with branch 1, let's look at the historical path, which to me feels like you're kind of making your way down in 3 smaller sections. The 8 points into the Burn the Paper Tigers into the leadership of Mao Zedong. The top half of this tree, starting with 8 points for attention, is about how you're going to be able to quickly expand in the very short window of time you have so that you're not just a 2-state minor. Your options are between westward and eastward expansion, using the border raid mechanic we have seen previously with a little bit of a rework. With Gotterdammerung, we saw how raids had been introduced into the game, and it seems like that mechanic has been adapted into the border raid mechanic that we got with Waking the Tiger. The goal then is to give you enough division attack and breakthrough bonuses to be able to smash through the enemy lines and conquer the territory before the Japanese arrive. They do note that this is not the only way for you to expand your territory early on. Usurp control over Yunnan allows you to just ask for some territory from Nationalist China, assuming you're allied with them. Following further down from that, with focuses like Burn the Paper Tiger, rallying the peasants and the Bolsheviks, you're really trying to unite the faction under one banner so that Mao Zedong can become the leader and really get going with his projects. Taking the focus, the leadership of Mao Zedong, gives you quite a hefty amount of stuff, from changing the balance of power to giving Mao a new trait which is just, well, really strong, no negatives at all. It can be a mistake among some players to think that many countries allow you to have an early window of growth, but in the case of things like Spain, you don't really have that opportunity, and I'm definitely feeling it with Communist China too. In your historical resistance against the Japanese invaders, you will have options to establish guerrilla cells in some of the states that they currently occupy. While expensive, this is to pave the way to working on more things, such as launching sabotage campaigns behind enemy lines to make sure the enemy divisions lose their supply, lose their division speed, gain attrition, be unable to build up more supply, just destroy them so that when you try and push against them in the counter-offensive, it should be like carving through butter. It helps a lot more if the Americans are attacking them too, of course. Of course, these infiltration tactics don't just have to be used against the Japanese. Taking a different focus can give you the option to use infiltration on Nationalist China. This means that when you choose to challenge their current leadership over the domain of China, you will be able to gain a flip event so that when war begins, you gain the state, as well as bonuses in that area. The dev diary continues by talking about more ways you can take advantage of these guerrilla cells, both against the Japanese and Nationalist China presumably, with the option to do raids against them on their supply depots. This will allow you to steal some of their infantry equipment, in this case very specifically Japan, for the goal of boosting up your own troops. You see, who needs to build an industry? You can simply steal everybody else's industry. And to wrap up the historical branch, we see a few more focuses that kind of cement Mao as the leader of the party, such as the Annan rectification movement, which really puts in their place the 28.5 Bolsheviks and ensures that Mao is ruling uncontested. Post-Mao dominance, you will find some additional focuses, such as these two here, which both provide bonuses to attacking and defending on Chinese core territory. So basically, I think once you've won some context against the Japanese, or the Japanese are on their last legs, you can flip the script and get all of the bonuses towards attacking nationalist China and stabbing them in the back. Hey, they were in a civil war all this time, it had to continue at some point. With the historical Maoist section done, let's take a look if you went the other way on the balance of power with the 28.5 Bolsheviks. From my very early sort of first look at the focus tree, it feels like, in contrast to Mao, that was running a very guerrilla, underground offensive against the Chinese government, this focus tree feels more like it's trying to show that China, or Communist China in this case, is the model China that the Soviets, for example, will be wanting to help unify and just take authority within faction. Of course, with focuses like Embrace Stalinism, you may be leaning pretty heavily on the Soviet Union. Since Mao will be going out the door, there are two alternatives we have access to: Wang Ming and his ideology monthly opinion gain and contribution to influence gain, so again, faction-related mechanics working alongside the nationalists, but also Bogu, who again, ideology monthly opinion, but this time a little bit more offensive, so maybe helping against the Japanese. The dev diary describes how when making the 28.5 Bolsheviks, their goal was to reflect a much more urban intellectual form of communism in China, as opposed to the more agrarian underground roots of Maoism, and with that, focuses like Embrace Stalinism, I suppose, is trying to build up the kind of Soviet-esque cities one can imagine finding in the Soviet Union. Perhaps presented here by the civilian factory construction speed. Oh yeah, it's even mirrored over here. I suppose then by going down this path, you might have slightly more reason to go down an industrial path earlier on, because you're going less on the offensive and more so about building up your territory, working alongside your larger faction, gaining faction influence, and at the bottom here, halves the cost for taking influence the faction decisions. The dev diary briefly shows off what some of these decisions would look like, so specifically sending Zhao Enlai off for political power gain to gain you some faction influence, 0.25 specifically, so not too much considering it's 50 PP to get it started. Perhaps then you would wait until you unlock tier 2 decisions to get to 0.75. Well, you gotta use something. As opposed to playing the underground game, it feels like you're going to be playing the overground game, or diplomatic game, I suppose, because once you reach tier 3 diplomacy decisions within the faction, you'll have the option to rally inside Chinese states using the infiltration mechanic, so that when you rise up, the state will be on your side. I suppose one could interpret this as using the same mechanic to reflect two different approaches to trying to convince the wider Chinese population to side with the communists. Ultimately, if you're going to be in conflict with China in the end though, there could be an argument to wanting to side with Mao, considering all the buffs he has to wartime offensive. And lastly, let's talk about an option, a third option, which seems to be completely on the other side of the political tree, the Unwilling Diarchy. And truth be told, it's not even that small. I guess Communist China does get some interesting alt history this time around. To experience this sudden change of events, you will have to wait for the arrival of Zhang Gaotao in the Chinese Soviet Republic to form an unwilling diarchy between Gaotao and Mao, completely avoiding the balance of power mechanic entirely. To experience this interesting change of events, you'll have to wait for Zhang Gaotao to arrive in the Chinese Soviet Republic, which starts the unwilling diarchy, the balance between Mao and Zhang for who will control the country. This will still take over the balance of power mechanic, but instead of being against the 28.5 Bolsheviks, you're instead going against Gaotao or Mao. Taking a look at the image more directly, it doesn't look like they're necessarily agreeing too well. In fact, it seems like they're probably mid-argument as the photo is taking place. Considering that most of the debuffs come in the form of static debuffs, i.e. they hinder you once but don't really come up again, I think it's worth it for the division attack on core territory plus 15%. Additionally, Gaotao himself, if you choose to side with him, comes with bonuses towards military factory construction speed, so really building up your own military, the Unwilling Diarchy isn't a bad option. It's a little bit hard to see at this point, but the thing to note here is that this takes some examples from the previous two trees. So on the left we can see a more Maoist infiltration style, because Mao is still Mao even during the Unwilling Diarchy, and on the right we can see some of the Soviet tactics, as Gartau is going with the more Bolshevik route. Regardless of which you pick, we will at some point have to bite the bullet and choose which of the two leaders are going to ascend. I'm afraid no diarchy lasts forever. Considering then that this is two separate paths that both give you the option to have Mao Zedong ascend, it will be interesting to figure out what the ultimate vibe is on whether it's more fun to play historical Mao or diarchy Mao. Two Maos, one focus tree. The Battle of the Maos. And so, going with the Maoist route will unlock the focus demand the loyalty of the warlords, which allows you to go around creating your own faction with some of the Babino nations around you. Alternatively, you could go with Zhang's preemptive strike and just go for straight out conflict against the nationalists while they're busy with the Japanese. Luckily, going this route, Mao might be a little more open to working alongside the Soviet Union, and so with it, you can gain some bonuses towards making infantry equipment, artillery support equipment, basically the most important stuff, nothing really there for rocket artillery. Where this focus really gets interesting to me though, is the decision at the end, once you have settled between Mao or Zhang, in how you're going to go with your exterior politics or foreign politics. And so in this case, you have the option to, okay, closer ties to the Soviet Union, that probably makes sense. Reach out to the West. I'm fascinated by the context of how you would be able to negotiate with Western major countries against fighting common enemies in the same way. It was already unstable enough working alongside the Comintern. By taking the focus, you will have access to trading of technology, so 2 bonuses towards infantry weapons and support artillery, as well as 5% research speed. With that, we have basically come to the end of the Unwilling Diarchy branch, which, similar to the previous branch, seems to be about unifying all of China, a core, common theme among all of the different branches, with again another focus talking about gaining bonuses, breakthrough, attack, militia attack, all towards attacking China. But we're not quite done, because yes, all of the different branches do seem to end with unifying China. Maybe there's a reason for that. Well, regardless of whichever branch you went down, Mao, Bolsheviks, Diarchy, they all have the option to work towards declaring the People's Republic of China. This is perhaps the most, conflicting part of the focus tree for me. It's the one I both like the most and I'm the most disappointed in. So let's take a look. Some of the focuses, the core one being the People's Republic, allows you to rename the country to the People's Republic of China. A research slot, very good. Justify war goal time finally gets fixed, considering that's probably been hurting you this whole time. On the left, we have options to go after some neighbouring countries, securing Taiwan, which at the time period is owned by the Japanese, going after Tibet, so your Western territory, subjugating Korea. There are even focuses to get some of the ports like Hong Kong, Macau, stuff like that, and dare to win. Ultimately, we seem to be seeing a series of focuses that kind of brings China into the vision of what we would imagine it to look like today. I mean, move the capital, rename Beiping to Beijing, and tons of factories there. Yeah, it's fine. It looks fine. But again, for a country that becomes so large, I'm very interested to see what these focuses at the very bottom do, because we saw with the Japanese, they have options to like core all of Asia, all the way up to Turkey and the Middle East. I do see a focus there that says the Asian Democratic Union. I mean, is this going to be a kind of similar focus to what we saw with the Japanese and their ability to core parts of Asia? I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm surprised there's no push towards, unifying against the Russians and maybe saying, okay, we should unite all Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union and China, and then you have like a core Russia path. As opposed to just a coring Asia path, you've got a core Russia path, a Chinese, Russian unification. That's the kind of thing I would expect with the Bolshevik line that they were going for. You literally embrace Stalinism at one point, so maybe you could have competed for them. Maybe that is. Avenge the century of humiliation, maybe it's the Chinese century. But it just kind of ends, and I was hoping there could be a little more to explore along some of these paths. That's not to mention as well that when it comes to focuses like subjugate Korea, I always dislike it if there's just war goals for no reason. I mean, sure, some people like that, I get it, but it's also interesting when there's a reason to go there. So you go there, okay, you could core it, but what if you could also create some kind of puppet state, or you can invest in it, or it serves a purpose for you, you turn it to like in a dockyard shipping area. Maybe that was too much of a little end of the branch rant, but when it comes to how do we really wrap up the story, the narrative of a focus tree, I think some focuses get it right and some focuses struggle, and whether that end branch really hits it is going to be difficult for me between I like this focus tree's end, or I'm like, oh, they could have done a bit more with it. With that though, we have come to the end of this week's Dev Diary. With it, we get a little bit of a teaser referring to the new 4th Army attacked by nationalist forces. I'm sure that doesn't sound very good for anybody involved. But ultimately, talking about Communist China specifically, yes, I think it's definitely a huge improvement over the previous version. It seems like they've really refined some of the very early days mechanics we saw in Waking the Tiger. There is a slight concern that when you've got 3, maybe 4 arguably branches, that all of them are going to feel somewhat samey, because the differences between them are kind of differences of bonuses. But the core goal between all branches is just to unify China. That's why I was talking earlier about I wondered if there was a way to explore other ways to go, different things to focus on. I suppose we'll wait and see. With that, if you liked this video, feel free to like, feel free to subscribe, and I guess I'll see you all for China next time. Bye, 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 bye.